Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. It looks like we are on video number 5. So that's the last video in the series that I've done on coral care. It's a very broad coverage of coral care, but going back to the original point of the video, I kind of wanted to make it as broad as we could without any real details. That way we could focus on the concept of things rather than focus on the real finite things that people get hung up on. So today our topic is chemistry, which is something that I'm extremely close to. I feel like is one of the most important things that we do here in our industry, in the hobby, because really, if you think about the general concept, we have a glass box full of water, so we're providing 100% of the habitat for these animals. The value in the video series here is being able to go back and reference different things that I talk about along the way, because the very first video I talked about who the viewers are, and we're talking to people who are young in the hobby, or inexperienced, or maybe slightly successful but still having problems. So I like the idea of having something on our YouTube channel that's like a little playlist. We'll put that together for y'all. And it's a reference point for when you're struggling, because I think the one thing that always holds true is anybody who's having a hard time with a reef tank, they always want to point the finger at something. And it's easier to not point the finger at something, but go back to just fundamentals and say, I know I didn't change my lighting. I know I didn't change my flow, but everything was good before that, right? So you're kind of recentering your frame of mind, where if it was good before, why is it different now? And then just think about the real basic fundamentals. You know, is it filtering properly? Is the water moving unanimously through the tank? Are you getting different corals that are telling you they're unhappy as opposed to before? You know, why those corals? So without getting too far into that, I think going back to it, it's very valuable to see 5 videos in one series of all very basic fundamental concepts, because when you're struggling and you go back to it, you may just have that aha moment where you go, oh, I didn't think of that. Chemistry is very simple. We're only worried about a few things. We're going to talk a little bit about alkalinity. We're going to talk about calcium. We're going to talk about magnesium. We're going to talk about nitrate and phosphate. Salinity is something that just trumps everything. So we'll talk about that first. That is 6 things that you're going to be responsible for testing. I'll talk a little bit about frequency. I'll talk about importance. But in a nutshell, if you're not testing for 6 things, you should be. So again, the first thing we're going to talk about is salinity. So some people measure in parts per thousand, some people measure in specific gravity. For all practical purposes, we're going to talk about specific gravity today, and we keep ours at 1.025. So we do 1.025 because 2.4 is not the end of the world, 2.6 is not the end of the world, okay? So that's right down in the middle. When we're looking at different minerals, alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, those 3 things can vary depending on what your specific gravity is. If your salt level is, say, 1.030, there's a pretty good chance that the density of those minerals is higher also, alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium. If it's lower, there's a pretty good chance that those will also be lower. So starting from the very beginning, when you start testing your water for the day, start with the salt. If it's not right, forego that, get it straightened out. Don't go dumping salt in the tank. Don't go dumping RO into the tank. Make small adjustments by way of water change, unless otherwise directed. But I think it's very simple to just do a water change, because every time you do that, it recalibrates. Think about the concept of diluting. If I have my salt at 1.030, which is 5 points higher than I would normally keep it, and I do a water change with salt that's 1.025, whatever that is, 20%, I'm going to be changing from 1.030, 20% less to 1.025. So if my specific gravity is 1.030 and I do a 20% water change, I'm going to be lessening that density of salt by 20%. And the same thing goes the other way. So if my salt level is low, call it 1.023, and I do a water change with 1.025, I'm bringing the salt up in my system. And because I'm only doing, call it a 20% water change, it's only modifying my water by 20%, which is really good because, again, going back to everything we said from the beginning of this video series, we're going for stability. So the smaller changes we make, the less impactful it is on the corals. So we talked about salt, locked it in, 1.025, 1.026, whatever it is, pick a number, stick to it. In order of importance, next is alkalinity. So if there's any one thing I can drive home to anybody who's relatively new to reef keeping, or even just new to having corals, period, alkalinity is critical. You'll see it measured in different ways, but for today, we're going to talk about it in form of DKH. At Worldwide Corals, we keep our DKH at, depending on the system, anywhere between 8 DKH and 10 DKH, which is a little bit narrower than the acceptable range, which is like 7 to 11. Call it middle of the road, 9. 9 is a good number because, again, just like I was talking about with the salinity, if you go a little bit low, to 8, or if you go even a little bit lower to 7, as long as it's not quick and dramatic, then it's not harmful. And the same thing the other way, if you go to 10, it's not the end of the world. You go to 11, it's not the end of the world as long as it's not quick and dramatic. We kind of like that number 9 because it's easy figuring. Most of your salts that you pick, whether it be Red Sea in the blue bucket, whether it be call it reef crystals or the Nio salt or something like Accuracy or Brightwell Neomarine, they're all going to mix anywhere between 9 and 11. So there's a couple different ways to manipulate alkalinity. One, you can use a part B or 2-part solution. I'll show you a couple different examples like Brightwell Reef Code A and B. You have ESV Bionic, which is a great product. Kalkwasser will also have an impact on your DKH. All of these we use to supplement the removal by way of coral growth. So as your corals grow, they're going to remove alkalinity from the water column. And this is important because if you're new to the hobby and you've not tested elk, I guarantee you it's low. Unless you use some crazy high parameter salt like the Coral Pro from Red Sea or something to that effect. The reality is, you'd be surprised how many times I've tested somebody's water and they're new to the aquarium hobby and they're like, man, I do my water changes, but I just can't seem to keep corals alive. That's the first question I ask. First, let me get a water sample. And second, do you measure your elk? When the answer is no, it's always low. Unless they're using some product like Coraline Grow or actually using a 2-part dosing system that they weren't instructed how to do properly. But for all practical purposes, low elk is the #1 killer if you're not testing it. So yeah, there's a handful of products out there that you can use to modify your alkalinity. Just remember, they all come in different concentrations. Just remember that everything done too quickly is harmful. I'd like to drive home the importance of using those types of products. If I just said that the #1 killer is low elk, if you're not testing for it, that means that it should be constantly used. So in most cases, if you've got coral, you should have a dosing pump, or you should have a calcium reactor, or you should be running Kalkwasser. But these devices are intended to give you long-term constant supply of alkalinity. And the reason for that is because it's consistent. If you're going to hand dose, just remember, you're going to get sick and tired of it, you're going to forget to do it, and it's not going to be as consistent. But you don't have to buy a doser. You don't have to spend all that money doing it. You can do it by hand. The fact of the matter is you have to do it, and you have to do it regularly. So after alkalinity, the next most important would be phosphate. The reason why I say phosphate is because if you're going to do a reef tank, you have to feed it. If you like fish, you feed pretty heavily. So the byproduct of that is always going to be input of organics, which is going to result in nitrate and phosphate. Phosphate is one of those things where it's always going to be there. If you're feeding enough in your reef tank, it's always going to be there. If you're feeding to get your corals like tip-top color, the best they can possibly look, you're going to have phosphate. So if you're not actively having a plan that's going to mitigate elevated levels of phosphate, then you should be. A lot of times what happens is I'll get customers that'll come in and they'll be like, man, my corals are just pale. Everything is doing amazing, but they're just pale. They're not as colorful as they should be. You know, and we go over the water test, and granted, you can only take so much out of a single water test or 2 water tests. It's the trend that matters, right? But you just know this customer or your buddy, whoever it is, they just always test 0 nitrate, 0 phosphate. A lot of times that's because they're just not putting enough organics in the tank. And the answer that I always get is, oh, I feed so much, it should be super high. I need to dose nitrate and phosphate. While that is definitely an answer, I think that there's a more logical solution, which means more living animals that need to eat. I don't care. Stock the tank completely full. Put bigger fish in there. Put more fish in there. Feed them more. Feed more frequently. Put a food doser on. Something. There's an easier way to skin that cat. So there needs to be an introduction of food, which is going to give you that byproduct of nitrate and phosphate. But specifically talking about phosphate, if you're feeding the right amount of food, you're going to always have to have some sort of removal media or plan to mitigate that phosphate. But again, third most important. Why? Because everybody deals with some sort of algae at some point. And they always want to point the finger at something else, but it's always the result of not getting those organics out of the tank. Just like we talked about in previous videos, that could be an export problem too. It could be an export problem coupled with too much light. It could be a too much food, poor export, and too much light. So again, go back to the previous videos and think about the things that I'm saying, but try to use your best application you can to fit your scenario, because it's not always phosphate that grows algae. If you're going to deal with algae, there's a pretty good chance that your phosphates are elevated. So that's first, second, third: salinity, alkalinity, phosphate. Fourth, for me, is going to be nitrate. So if you're listening close enough, you should know that if you're going to test anything frequently, it should be salt. If you test anything frequently, it should be alkalinity. Outside of that, nitrate and phosphate, you can probably start doing that once a week, or even if your tank is a little bit more dialed in and you trust it more, or you trust your process more and you stay on a regular water change schedule, test those every 2 weeks. It's not the end of the world. You're not going to have a 0.01 phosphate reading today and then a 0.10 phosphate reading tomorrow. That just doesn't happen. If so, there could be a fluke with the test. If so, your kid dumped a whole bucket of flake inside of your tank. But the reality is, in a normal scenario, there's really not going to be that chance of that happening. You're going to deal with nitrate if you are feeding really heavy, if your tank's bio is not capable of supporting the amount of input that you have. If your skimmer's not working correctly, if you're not doing your water changes on schedule, if your water changes aren't big enough, if your flow and export are not up to par. There's a multitude of reasons for nitrates being elevated. But again, same as phosphate, it doesn't just happen overnight. So I would say that's probably number 4. Salt, alkalinity, phosphate, nitrate. Those 4, if you could figure out how to just manage those 4 parameters and keep them stable at one given number, or at least within an acceptable parameter range, you're going to be successful. Even if your lights aren't the best, even if your flow is not the best, even if your water change schedule is slightly off. If you're a busy person, all those things, they'll have an impact on how well the tank does. But if you can manage those 4 things at least to a moderate roar, you're going to be successful. I like this because it's good to talk about how much stuff is on the internet and it makes it difficult to follow. Just remember those few things. It's really quite simple. You can set up a tank today with established rock. You can set up a tank today with the right amount of inverts and put coral in it. Literally all in the same day with decent lights, with decent flow. And you're going to be successful until one of those parameters goes outside of their acceptable range. You see us do it all the time at these shows. We'll go and we'll set up, I don't know, 1,000 corals inside of those 2 little frag tanks, 3 little frag tanks. And they look amazing on day 1. On day 2, they're looking a little bit less amazing. If it's a 3-day show, by day 3, they're looking a little bit worn and weathered. Why? They're getting brighter light than they normally do. They're not getting the flow like they normally do. They're not in the same environment with all the fish and the inverts picking and cleaning and the export happening from the filtration. All that stuff compounds the more life is in the tank. So think about that. If I've got 2 3-foot frag tanks and I've got 800 to 1,000 corals there, the amount of living animal versus water and bio is way out of whack. So that's why they live there. That's why they look good for a little while, and that's why they degrade quickly. So that's a very expedited scenario, and it's not obviously normal. But in your case at home, the same thing can happen. It's all about balance, it's all about routine, and it's all about sticking to a schedule that works for your scenario. Left on the list is magnesium and calcium. Look, I treat these the same. I feel like they're important to have there. They're important to a certain quantity, and it's usually like a 3-to-1 ratio. You know, if you've got 1,500 mag, you've got 500 calcium. It's pretty much the ionic balance that we have. And you can scale that down too, right? Magnesium and calcium is fundamental in that building process of coral skeleton, along with your alkalinity, but they all have to be in proportion. So treat them exactly the same. You don't put calcium in without magnesium. They don't stay in solution the same. You don't put magnesium without calcium. It doesn't work that way. So calcium and magnesium are very important, but again, it's being used at a much slower rate than alkalinity is. And you can look at the number too. If magnesium is 1,500, which is a little on the high side, it's the most available ion because there's 1,500 of them. And then second most is going to be your calcium. Okay, so the abundance of that material in the water means that it doesn't change as quickly or as frequently as the others do. So that's why I leave them low on the list. So again, salinity, alkalinity, phosphate, nitrate, calcium, magnesium. I think as long as you understand that, testing is like literally basic. Do alkalinity once a week. Do salinity once a week. Everything else, push it off. If you want to do alkalinity daily because you're having a hard time dialing in your doser, it doesn't mean that you need to test nitrate and phosphate daily. It doesn't mean that you need to test magnesium daily. Focus on the very beginning side of that scale or that order of importance, and you'll be successful. All right, so why was it important for me to stand up here in front of the camera today and talk about generalized water testing stuff? I'll tell you. It's because this is 100% non-negotiable. All the other stuff that we talked about, water movement, nutrient export, lighting, flow, all that stuff, those are all variables. So in order to be successful, we need to do our part and try to limit those variables. Water chemistry can never be one of them. So this is the point that I really want to drive home here. So in every case, you want to make sure that there's never a question that your water chemistry is not right. Let me repeat that. There should never be a time where you can point your finger at the water chemistry and say, that's the reason why my tank is not doing well. Why? Because you have too many other burdens to bear. You need to make sure that your tank is being fed properly. You need to make sure that your lighting is functioning well. You need to make sure that your flow and your export is good. Why? Because those are things that are going to vary from time to time on their own. You cannot worry about water chemistry. This is something, again, it's non-negotiable. If you're going to get into this hobby, you need to hold yourself accountable for that. You need to make sure your water chemistry is on point. And I'm not saying go changing it to make sure that this caters to that coral or your tank does better at this parameter range. No. Pick a number and stick to it. As long as it's within the range, stay there. Because that's the non-negotiable part of this. As soon as you go changing your chemistry, it's going to throw a whole slew of things out of whack. So just remember that it compounds. It's kind of like this. Let's say you're an athlete and you've got a big race tomorrow. Well, you've already put in the time and energy. You've worked out. You've trained hard. You got the right mindset. You got the right gear. You're ready to go. But then you go to sleep tonight and you sleep like a fool. You're going to get up tomorrow and it's all for waste. It's literally all for none. Why? Because that one variable changed everything else that you put the work into already. So that's no different. You know, you can have a big exam the next day, or you could have a big function at work that you need to be prepared for. You spend all this time on. You get a poor night's sleep. Next thing you know, you wake up tomorrow and you're a flop. So that's the same exact thing. You could spend all this money on equipment. You can spend all this money on redundancies and time and energy and thought and planning. And if you don't execute the water chemistry, well, guess what? You literally fail. Again, if you're going to get into this hobby, expect to test your water. If you can say, I've had a successful tank without testing your water, well, cool, you're lucky. You're the 1%er. It doesn't mean everybody else is going to do it. So the moral of the story here, look, take it from me. I know how to keep a reef tank without testing my water. I have a pretty good idea of what's going on just by looking at it or knowing what's happened in the last few days that led up to a certain incident. I'll be the first person to tell you, though, that if something's wrong, that's my 100% go-to. I'm going right to the water test. Why? Because I need to know more information. So that being said, if I need to know more information, that means that I should have already known. If you're going to get into this hobby or you're in this hobby and you want to be lazy, this is not the hobby for you. But you do that well, I can guarantee you at least partial success. Another little anecdote to kind of add to that. I've been testing water and helping to coach people along for quite some time now. And it always seems like everybody who is slightly diligent about their aquarium has the most unique scenario that nobody else has ever seen. And I'll tell you, this is not true. So if I have other store owners out there that are watching, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They bring in a water sample and they say, oh, you know, I test my water. I did this, I did that. Let me show you the graph of things. And miraculously, they have an event that nobody else has. I'll tell you, if you dig in deep enough, you'll find that there's not enough truth in there. There's something that happened and they're not being forthcoming about, or they're just not paying close enough attention. That's not just to call everybody out. That's only to add to this. If you're going to keep a reef tank, hold yourself accountable. You're not the only situation out there. Stay on top of your water chemistry. Do your part. Be honest with yourself, because if you're going to be successful, it's on you. It's not on somebody else. So look, I'll go over just a real basic rundown of acceptable parameters. And I think that this is going to be a very broad range. And that's, again, it's to give everybody the opportunity to do it their way, because there's really no 100% right way to do things. Kind of like cooking. Like, I may cook one way, you may cook another, and they both turn out good. Salt, 1.024 to 1.026. That's a great range. Pick one, stay there. Don't vary from 2.4 to 2.6 in a short period of time. And when I say a short period of time, I mean in a week, in 2 weeks. Try to stick to one number. We use 0.25. That is our target. Elk, anywhere between 7 and 11. You heard me say earlier, 8 and 10. That's because it's a little bit more finite. I don't like to go from 7 to 11 in any given scenario. But look, if you've got an elk that's a 7, it's not critical. You're not going to kill stuff. If you have elk at 11, it's not critical. It's not going to kill stuff. Shoot for 9, somewhere around there. And you don't want the variance to be much. So if in 1 week you're going from, let's say, 8.3 to 9.5, you might want to slow down on your dosing, just as an example. Or the same thing, the other way around. If you started at 9.5 and by the end of the week you're at 8.3, it's time to start worrying about how you're going to get that back to 9. Why? Because from 9.5 to 8.3 in a week is a big swing. You don't really want to see in between tests any more than 0.5 to 1 in change. PO4. A lot of times you see phosphate written like this. You want to be anywhere from 0.03, not 0.30, to 0.10. You can operate outside of 0.10. I've seen it many times over, but it does retard the growth a little bit on your corals, so you kind of want to stay under that 0.1 range. You also run the higher risk of dealing with algae or other issues in that maybe browning corals, maybe just not entirely unanimous health in the aquarium. Phosphate's a big one. Nitrate. Pretty much we shoot for under 20. 25 is okay too. The reason why we do this is this 20, you're going to find a lot of times that if you've got a bunch of LPS corals, they probably do way better in that 20 ppm range. And if you were to bring it down closer to 5, which is where I personally like to keep mine, you're going to find that a lot of those LPS corals that were accustomed to that 20 ppm, they're not going to be happy at all. It's the change. Again, just like any of these here, if the change is too much, the corals aren't going to be happy. Pick a number. Under 20 is fine. If I have acros, I really like to shoot for 5. That's just a personal thing. Here at Worldwide Corals, we shoot for under 20. For me, I find it easier to manage my nitrates if I'm at 5 with an acro-specific tank. Calcium. Anything pretty much from 400 to 500. 350 is kind of on the low side, but it's still acceptable. But just pick a number in there. 400 to 500 is a really good spot. Mag. Anywhere between 13, I don't know, call it 1320 and 1440. For a while during COVID, I'm not sure what happened with a lot of the manufacturers, but we were seeing salt that was testing outside of 1400. I'm really not entirely sure what that's about. I want to say it's a raw material sourcing issue, but since then it's kind of come back down. Anywhere between 1300 and 1400 is pretty good. Just remember what I said. This is 1 part, this is 3. So that range of 1 part to 3 is where you want to be for calcium and magnesium. But guess what? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I didn't mention things like pH. I didn't mention things like ORP. If you have controllers and they test those parameters for you, monitor them. You kind of want to see how high things go and how low things go. pH is a big one. We can talk about that specifically one day. But for today's discussion, if we just focus on these 6 things, I'm telling you, this is the part that's non-negotiable. If you can stay there, it's going to be a success for you. This weekend, the 7th and 8th, we're going to be in Anaheim. So for any of you guys that are coming out to Reefapalooza, make sure you come see us. Last time in New York, man, there were so many people that came that watch our channel just to talk to us and ask questions. I loved it. I thought it was incredible. It was very welcoming. Vic and I are going to be at the booth again. Yeah, come give us some support and chat it up. We like talking about reef stuff. And I think Vic even mentioned that we're bringing 50 giveaway shirts too. So free shirts, nobody can say no to that. Don't forget, that is the 7th and 8th of September. And I believe we're doing a Q&A. So if you want to take part in that, on the 8th, Vic and I are going to be doing a Q&A there. We'd really love to see you. It's going to be a killer show anyways. The floor plan looks awesome. That being said, I think that's the end of this video. Don't forget to test your water. Make sure you stay on top of your aquarium. Pay attention to it really closely because it tells you the answers. I want to thank everybody again for your support. If you want to see the very first video in this series, we'll post that here. And then the very last video that we did, we'll make sure we get up here. Again, like and subscribe. Make sure you hit the notification so you see when our videos come out. See you next time.